Welcome back to the Catholic Church, Builder of Civilization. I'm Thomas Woods, and we're looking today at international law. Sounds like kind of a dry subject, but as you can see, it actually isn't at all. Because the idea of international law simply means that there are certain fixed rules that everybody has to observe, and that you can't say that, well, this people is more backward than we are, or they haven't achieved what we have, so we can just trample them, and this and that. There's nothing like that in what the Catholic Church teaches. Now, just before the break, we were talking about what happened when people in Spain began to hear about some of the abuses toward the natives of the New World at the hands of some Spaniards. And so, in fact, Spanish theologians began thinking about all the implications and consequences of this. They began thinking about the questions they needed to ask. Are there rules that should govern the interaction of peoples? What are those rules? Is our own government living up to those rules? Well, Father Francisco de Vitoria, whom I mentioned immediately before the break, was a professor at the University of Salamanca, and he has sometimes been called, along with the Dutch Protestant Hugo Grotius, who came much later, the father of international law. In fact, a man named James Brown Scott, writing in the 1920s in a book called The Spanish Origin of International Law, tells us that Vitoria furnished the world of his day with its first masterpiece on the law of nations in peace as well as in war. Now, in a separate episode, we've discussed a little bit of the ins and outs of the just war theory. Now, what Vitoria was interested in was determining the treatment to which all human beings were entitled by right, by natural right, because they were human beings. And he insisted that these rights that people possessed came from their status as human beings, rather than because they were Catholics or anything else, Europeans, Spaniards. So their right not to be killed or not to be robbed. This comes to you not because, well, you're Catholic or you're of my race. It comes to you because you're a human being with a rational nature. And the exercise of these rights is the way in which you can live out your rational nature. You need to have a right to life. You need to have a right to own property in order to function in the world. So these things are natural rights, and they are rights that apply to everybody. So what this means in principle, in practice as well, is that no Catholic would argue that it's a less serious crime to kill somebody who's not baptized and a more serious crime to kill a baptized person because the baptized person is more important or something like that. Absolutely not. That is not what the Church teaches. And to the contrary, Father Domingo de Soto, who is Vitoria's colleague at the University of Salamanca, said this. He said, "Those who are in the grace of God, that is good, faithful Catholics, are not a whit better off than the sinner or the pagan in what concerns natural rights." Now again, isn't that kind of the opposite of the impression I think people have about the Church over the years? I think people have this impression that the Church would be inclined to give certain favor to those who belong to the household of faith. But to the contrary, as we see here, some of her finest thinkers in the 16th century say, if not the opposite, then they state something that is true for everybody, that all these rights are to be enjoyed equally by everybody because we all share a common human nature. And we aren't, incidentally, just a clump of cells. We are human beings with dignity, and that dignity demands these rights. Now, what does Vitoria conclude, looking at the situation of his government and the peoples of the New World? He said that the peoples of the New World, because they were human beings, just as we Spaniards are human beings, they were equal to us. They were equal to us in matters pertaining to natural rights. They owned their lands by the same principles that we Spaniards own our own. And he also argued that, and incidentally his fellow scholastics agreed with him, Domingo de Soto, Molina and others, that pagan princes ruled legitimately. That is to say, if a pagan king has committed no other crime he can't simply be thrown out and deposed because he's a pagan. Now, that, too, I think is the opposite of what people think. People would think that the church believes that if a ruler is non-Catholic, they can just go in and throw him out and put a Catholic there. Well, in a certain way, I mean, I bet in the United States we wish we could do that sometimes, but that's not what the church teaches. What the church teaches and what Vittoria teaches here is that each state has the same rights as any other, the same rights to self-government, and is under an obligation to respect the rights of others. So regardless of the religion of the ruler, if that ruler has committed no other crime, nobody has a right to just topple him for no reason other than he's a non-Catholic. You can't simply do that. Now, Vittoria and his supporters also believed that the idea of natural law existed not just among Christians, but among all peoples. Now, natural law, of course, is the idea that there are laws that are in effect written in our human heart that we simply know. When you're a child, you know. You know these laws. You know when little children are running around, they're saying, hey, that's mine, give it back. They understand certain aspects of what it means to be just and fair, that I had this property first, and it's unjust for someone to confiscate it from me. And they understand perfectly well that if they take something from somebody else, they cry when you punish them, but typically they understand the punishment. They don't say, Mom, Dad, I have a whole philosophical argument against why you're punishing me. They know in their heart they've done something wrong. Well, we have these senses of what is right and wrong. We also have the Ten Commandments in our own tradition. But according to Vittoria, the Ten Commandments are really spelling out principles that practically any people, really, if they reflect long enough, will understand and appreciate. And because we all possess this kind of sense of right and wrong, a basic sense, then this basic sense can become the basis for international rules of conduct. And these rules of conduct can morally bind even those who've never heard the gospel, or never heard of the Ten Commandments, or had even rejected the gospel, because we're basing ourselves on the idea that we all ultimately know that sheer conquest is wrong, and looting and pillaging is wrong. We know this because God has imprinted it on our hearts, and this becomes the basis for a common understanding of international obligation. Now, that is to say that peoples, such as the peoples of the New World, were thought to possess this basic sense of right and wrong, summed up in the Ten Commandments and in the Golden Rule, and so we could interact with them on the understanding that they understand these principles, but we have to understand and live according to them too. So what this means is that in the 16th century, Spanish theologians looked at the behavior of their own civilization. They held it up to critical scrutiny, and they found it wanting. They looked and said, we have failed to live up to the absolute moral standard that binds all people. They proposed that in matters of natural right, the other peoples of the world were their equals, and that the commonwealths, even of pagan peoples, were entitled to the same treatment that the nations of Christian Europe accorded to one another. Now that is something extraordinary in the history of the world. And we in no way wish to make light of what happened to the peoples in the New World, because many of them perished, sometimes in terrible circumstances, oftentimes due to disease, a non-volitional source, sometimes due to overwork. And it was something terrible in some ways, what happened to a great many of these people. But the very fact that the Spaniards could step back and say, my people have failed to live up to an absolute standard is something new in the world. A historian named Louis Hankey wrote a book called The Spanish Struggle for Justice in the Conquest of America. Now that's a strange title, isn't it? But what he's talking about is precisely what we've seen here. The Spanish theologians' attempt to devise rules that would bind everybody and that would establish justice in the world. And their ability, the Spaniards' ability to look objectively at these foreign peoples and recognize their common humanity was no small achievement. In fact, this type of impartiality, this ability to look at the peoples of the world and be willing to apply the same rules to other peoples that you apply to your own, and that you would abide by the same rules that you expect others to abide by. This impartiality is not exactly embedded in every civilization. In fact, we need look no further, for example, than the American Indian cultures, which, for whatever their merits, did not possess the ability to look impartially at the world and hold themselves up to a common moral standard. The Harvard historian Samuel Eliot Morison said that the Indians of the same region or language group did not even have a common name for themselves, and that each tribe called itself something like "we the people" and referred to its neighbors by a word that meant the barbarians, or sons of she-dog, or something equally insulting. Well, if that's your view, that you are the people and everybody else are the barbarians or sons of the she-dog, how are you going to be able to come up with impartial rules governing both you and the barbarians? It's not going to happen. So the idea of an international order of states, some large, some small, of varying levels of civilization and refinement, operating on a principle of equality, one toward the other, this could not have found fertile ground amid that kind of narrow chauvinism, a kind of chauvinism that has been all too prevalent in the history of the world. So it's thanks to the Catholic conception of the fundamental unity of the human race that we're able to think in terms of universal principles governing all peoples. So when we criticize Spanish excesses in the New World, therefore, it's largely thanks to the moral tools provided by the Catholic theologians of Spain itself that we're able to do so. The Peruvian poet Mario Vargas Llosa, when he spoke about these Spanish critics of their own government's policy, he said this: "They fought against their fellow men and against the policies of their own country in the name of a moral principle that to them was higher than any principle of nation or state. This self-determination, this capacity for criticism of your own civilization could not have been possible among the Incas or any of the other pre-Hispanic cultures. In these cultures, as in the other great civilizations of history foreign to the West, the individual could not morally question the social organism of which he was a part." Well, let's conclude now by saying that we have seen that, in theory, the Catholic Church has set up and established and defended these universal moral principles. And perhaps they have been observed in the breach at times, but these are the principles. And the additional principle, of course, is that there's to be no forced conversion. That's in canon law. All these things are Catholic principles. What we're going to see next time is an aspect of modern history that's often been forgotten, when anti-Catholic or atheistic states, in effect, establish the opposite principle, that people have the opposite of rights because they're Catholic. Because they're Catholic, they can be imprisoned or tortured or killed. And we are once again going to see this glorious witness of Catholics in the face of devastation. Join me for the Catholic Church, Builder of Civilization.